Welcome to the latest episode of our podcast series for financial advisors, the annual update on advisor transitions and deals, 2024 edition. It's an industry update with Louis Diamond. I'm Jason Diamond, and this is the Diamond Podcast for financial advisors.
At Diamond Consultants, our mission is to help advisors live their best business life. We want every elite advisor to find exactly the right place for their business and their clients to thrive, whether it's at a wirehouse, a regional, boutique, or independent firm. As the industry's leading recruiters and consultants, we've transitioned more than $250 billion in assets under management in the past decade, and each year, 25% of transitioning advisors who manage $1 billion or more are our clients. If you'd like to talk, please feel free to give us a call at 908-879-1002. Are you a financial advisor who's curious about whether you're in the best place to serve clients, or if there might be a better way to optimize your business for the future? Should I Stay or Should I Go is a new book that serves as a self-guided journey, walking you through the key steps that Diamond Consultants takes with our advisor clients, whether considering change or not. Visit diamond-consultants.com/thebook to learn more.
Why do advisors change firms? That simple question set us on a journey that began 4 years ago when we first conceived our advisor transition report. The cynical view is that advisors move primarily because they get paid highly lucrative recruiting deals to do so. With firms willing to pay aggressive multiples of revenue to recruit advisors, that explanation certainly holds some weight. But what about the thousands of advisors who opted for a version of independence, where transition capital is less available and in some cases non-existent? Or countless advisors who approach due diligence with complete disregard for recruiting deals, preferring to evaluate each firm on their own merits because their only focus is how to make life better for their clients. It stands to reason, then, that dollars alone are not a sufficient explanation for advisor movement, and certainly not to the high degree we've seen movement in recent years. That's why we publish our annual advisor transition report, to take on the task of connecting the dots between the raw movement data and the answers to the overarching question of why. All of this with the goal of arming advisors with the information they need to make an informed decision, even those who have no intention of making a move, but simply want to be empowered with knowledge. In this special industry update, Louis Diamond and I click into the findings and share a few post-publication insights. And there's a lot to share, so let's get to it. Louis, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, of course. This is always one of my favorite episodes, and we've done such a thorough job of this report. So excited to talk about some of the key findings and takeaways and some of our predictions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite episodes too. Let's get right to it. The way I'm thinking about this discussion is let's definitely talk about the key takeaways and the predictions from the report. And I also want to make sure we save some time to talk through some representative deals, because I think those are great case studies into what other advisors are hearing and saying and seeing. So let's start with the basic numbers here. A total of 9,615 experienced advisors changed firms in 2024. And remember, the report covers the entirety of 2024, but we only count experienced advisors, and that's an important point. By experienced advisors, we're talking about advisors with more than 3 years length of service. We measure that because we feel that's really what a productive advisor sort of baseline is. We're not trying to capture trainees or people who have no book of business when we look at this movement data. The second thing I'll say is that number is more or less in line with years past, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. And then the last thing I want to mention just as a high-level takeaway is when we look at where advisors move to and from, it's fairly consistent with years past. And what I mean by that is we typically see advisors more commonly move within their channel, so from wirehouse to wirehouse or independent broker-dealer to independent broker-dealer, as opposed to moving outside of their given channel. And I mention that because I think there's this perception that everybody's going independent or everybody's jumping ship from the wires, and our data shows that's not the case. So before we move on to our next topic here, Louis, any thoughts on that?
So Jason, let me just layer on top of your comments a couple of perspectives. So if you look at 9,615 experienced advisors, meaning those with 3 years of length of service or more that changed firms in 2024, it is fairly consistent with 2023. And there's numbers that float around the industry, such as there's 300,000 financial advisors in the space. We actually think the number's much less, especially if you take into account the 3-year length of service bar and stripping out some folks that we wouldn't consider to be traditional advisors. So folks have told me, and I've seen it through our data as well, that in a given year, it's about 5 to 6% of the industry changes over. We actually think it's more like 3.5% or so based upon how we're viewing experienced advisors. So a different figure, but I think for good reason. What this tells us is even though 2023 and into 2024, there was a lot of uncertainty, like there always is, it was still a very healthy year for advisor movement. And advisors remain fully in the driver's seat for choosing their own destiny. And one other comment I'll make just on where advisors move to and from. I completely agree from our own experience in the data that most often advisors will move within their own channel. We'll talk a little bit about some of the wirehouse dynamics, but we don't think the wirehouses are going anywhere. Same thing with the independent broker dealers. There's been reports that have been out about how market share of the wirehouses and independent broker dealers is slipping. So while that may be true, I can't contradict the data. I know that both of those models have a ton of relevance and will continue to capture and retain most of their advisors going forward.
I totally agree. And I think actually it's a good pivot to let's talk some about what the raw data proves for the winners. And we can also mention some of the losers. To me, two of the biggest winners, and it's really not just this year, it's kind of going back the last 4 years since we've been tracking this data. I think you have to mention Morgan Stanley and LPL, which is obviously a wirehouse and an independent broker dealer. Can you share your thoughts at a high level, though, on the winners and losers for 2024 in the recruiting game?
Yep. Yeah. And honestly, I think the winners in 24 were consistent with 2023 and probably similar to 2022 as well. So, like you said, I think the rich get richer. On the wirehouse side, Morgan Stanley definitely had the most success as far as recruits won, but also overall retention. Raymond James, across their various channels, did a bang up job and honestly was the top recruiting firm in the regional firm bucket. Rockefeller, which has been a category of its own these days as a boutique firm, didn't pick up as many advisors as Morgan Stanley and Raymond James, but the transitions they facilitate tend to be much larger on average. And they had a very meaningful market share of the $1 billion plus teams that were in transit. LPL recruited over 3,000 advisors last year, which is a mix of their own recruiting efforts, which we try to track, but also bringing over advisors that were on the platforms of some banks that began to outsource to LPL and a couple of acquisitions. But we think LPL and really all these firms will continue to be top of mind for advisors in transit. And with the case of LPL and Raymond James, the multiple ways to affiliate is definitely driving things and having creative ways to service advisors up and down the spectrum of what they're trying to accomplish. And then as far as folks who didn't do as good of a job of recruiting and retaining advisors, the firms that come to mind are Merrill, which we'll talk about a little bit in more detail. Edward Jones had another year of very high attrition, despite adding a lot of advisors, but many of them don't have the experience threshold that we look for. Mass Mutual had some losses, as did Cetera. So that includes a wirehouse, a regional or super regional, and then an insurance-based firm and an independent broker dealer. So if you look at how it breaks down, no type of firm or model is immune to losing folks, but there's certainly winners in each category and also some that are not doing as good of a job.
Yeah, so I agree. And I think what I think of there, especially when you talk about the losers or the not losers, perhaps I should say, the firms that did a less good job recruiting and retaining talent, there's two ways to think about it. Number one is you can think about it through the lens of the 2024 number, and you can say Merrill didn't have a tremendous year. But I think the more helpful way to look at the numbers is to say, relative to previous years, and even relative to what we're seeing in the beginning of 2025, what is the story of the firm or the anecdotal experience of the firm like? And to me, Merrill is a good example. And I want to highlight Merrill here for a second because that's a major storyline from 2024 is Merrill's reentry into the competitive recruiting space. And that was not a given. So this is the first time we're seeing all four wires back in the competitive recruiting space, at least for the past 5 or so years. And even for advisors who are currently at Merrill or for advisors who will never move to Merrill, it's a good thing. More competition. It also shows Merrill's continued commitment to the wealth management space. So I just want to mention that although I would agree with you that Merrill did have a quote unquote down year in terms of advisor recruiting, I would actually argue that they had a good year in 2024 because I think they righted the ship in a lot of ways and set the table for a stronger 2025 going forward. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think. If I'm an advisor at Merrill, why does it even matter to me that Merrill's back recruiting? Like, how does that change things?
Yeah, I'll give you two answers to that. Number one is just from a morale perspective, I think it is demoralizing that Merrill advisors, really for the past probably 5 years, maybe even longer, just saw their top peer, sophisticated corner office colleagues leaving in droves. And that has an effect on morale and office culture, especially when you're not restocking the pond with competitive recruits the other way. Because as you said, everybody loses teams. The question is, are you continuing to bring in new teams and revitalizing the firm? So one answer is just morale, but the other is I think it signals a recommitment to the wealth management business, which again was not always a given.
Yep. And I would layer on top of it too that even if you're an advisor at Merrill, and obviously you're not going to get a recruiting deal from Merrill like you would if you went to UBS or Morgan Stanley or Wells Fargo. Merrill right now is a top bid in the market. The wires especially look at one another and tend to move in lockstep. So it's just basic supply and demand. If there's more demand from another credible bidder who actually happens to have probably the top deal out there right now, it just either keeps a floor on deals or makes it so that firms like Morgan Stanley, UBS, Wells Fargo, and others have to really bring their A game and can't try to pull back on deals or do things differently. So it just helps in the competitive dynamics if an advisor is running a thorough process.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And I think you've now spoken more at the firm level in terms of winners and losers, but I'd like to also address this from the channel level. And I agree with you, the wires aren't going anywhere. They continue to serve a very important niche or hole in the market. It's not even a niche because they're so big, but let's talk just from a channel level. Do you view the wires as still the tail that wags the dog, or are there more legitimate options in your mind than ever before?
I mean, there's certainly many more legitimate options. And it's not just that if you're a very large advisor, you have more options. It's options for really any size business. And even though the wires might capture 50% of advisors within channel that are moving, it means there's a whole lot of market share left to be had for every other type of firm, whether it's the regionals or super regional firms, the boutiques, supported independents, which we can talk more about, independent broker dealers, the RIA model. And really, there's for a large team, I have a group now that does over 10 million in trailing 12. And we legitimately have 35 legitimate options for their business. So I've never advised someone to speak to that many firms or consider them, but it's helpful to know that there's that many legitimate choices where this big, sophisticated team could actually do their business. And if this was a couple of years ago, maybe it was 6 to 8 legitimate options, more choices. Again, great for advisors, great for competitive dynamics. And we think there's a lot of market share to be had for really every firm that has a compelling story, regardless of the industry channel.
Yeah, I think that's right. We see this one kind of both ways. On the one hand, you hear some people say like the wirehouse is dead. And then on the other hand, there's certainly some advisors who feel like the wirehouses are the center of the universe and the only firms on the street. So I want to ask you a follow up to that. I think one of the interesting things from last year was a number of really big, impressive names in wealth management who were ex wirehouse leaders started or joined or grew more independent firms. I won't say independent firms, but firms that are certainly more independent than a wirehouse. So I'm thinking like John Thiel, Dave Koach, and then Greg Fleming's probably the most notable example, although not a news story at the helm of Rockefeller. Is that to you an indictment of the wirehouse space that all of these ex-wirehouse leaders are now in less bureaucratic and rigid models?
I don't think it's necessarily an indictment, but if you look at these individuals that were absurdly successful and had super high profile and powerful jobs at their previous employers, I think it's folks who saw that they can create something in their own image. They can own real equity value. And if they believe they can recruit advisors and build a value prop that didn't exist before, that they can make a bigger impact, both in their own personal financial situation, but also on serving advisors better. So I don't think it's an indictment of those models at all. I think it's more so that there's benefit to starting something and building. And these folks all probably were ready for their next act, which was entrepreneurship. And there's tons and tons of other examples too. If you look at Jim Dixon, who started Sanctuary and now runs Elevation Point and was former Merrill, or his partner Brad Smithy, who was at UBS, or Vince Fertitta from Sanctuary, or Jim Gold from Stored Partners. Really, most of the alternative models that big and even just any wirehouse advisor especially would consider outside of Ray J, RBC, et cetera, likely had a very significant wirehouse pedigree. So I think it just shows that advisors, they value folks that kind of can walk the walk and talk the talk. And there is benefit to the relationship capital that a lot of these folks have built.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is those folks are better able to recruit wirehouse advisors because they know a lot of them and they speak the same language. I also think part of it, though, is these folks felt like that's where the puck is or was heading. So that's a good segue. And I know that not all of the folks we just mentioned lead truly independent channels, but I want to talk about breakaway activity. So meaning when advisors go from a captive channel like a wirehouse to an independent channel, whether that's a broker dealer or an RIA, a platform firm. What are your thoughts on the space? Do you still see the same velocity? I know we've been pretty vocal for the past several years that the supported independent space is a very attractive and hot pocket of the market. Do you still feel that way? Has the momentum changed at all as it relates to the breakaway space? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, so I would say the breakaway movement, it's not even a movement anymore. It's more just, it's here to stay. It's not going away. Before it was a trend or maybe a flash in the pan, but now it's proven enough staying power that it's not going anywhere. I would say we see slightly less breakaway movement than in years past. Part of the reason could be the low hanging fruit of folks that were super entrepreneurial have already left, or it could be because of the retire in place programs that keep a lot of advisors and teams captive for a long time, or it could just be there's better deals, there's more options, and you don't necessarily have to break away to achieve what you're looking to achieve. There could also be some truth that if you look at 2024 movement, that maybe there is a little bit of an overhang from the regional banking crisis, and advisors valued the flight to safety, which were large banks with balance sheets, and maybe some thought twice about breaking away as a result. But honestly, like we're talking about 2024, but I'll give you a quick look ahead. I think 2025 is going to be probably the biggest year of breakaway movement we've ever seen. And it's going to be with some of the largest breakaway transitions that have ever happened. That could be whether it's related to the UBS compensation plan change. It could be new models that have catalyzed advisors around supported independence, different capital structures, or it's just potentially a part of the normal business cycle. But I think breakaway movement not going anywhere. 2024, a bit of a pullback on breakaways, but 2025 is going to be an absolute record.
Perfect segue, because I'd like to shift gears now and talk about some of our predictions for 2025 as we look ahead. And honestly, we don't like to single out individual firms. Oftentimes we try pretty hard not to. But in my mind, when we think about 2025, we have to mention UBS because the recent compensation plan change that they announced in late 2024 is the seminal event in the wirehouse space as I see it going ahead. It has roiled so many advisors. I think that's what was so unique about it. And I know we've done podcasts and spoke at length about the details of the compensation plan, but my number one takeaway is that no one was immune. Just about every single UBS advisor, I think the best case scenario was you were more or less neutral, and most people took a pretty meaningful hit to compensation. It's less a story about the compensation plan in and of itself to me, and more a story about what does it represent? Does it represent future cost cuts? Or more importantly, does it just represent this ongoing kind of battle for control where the firm is trying to take more and more from advisors and provide less? So I mention this because I think UBS will likely be, to your point about independence being very attractive, those advisors have to come from somewhere. And I think we'll see UBS be the biggest donor of share or the biggest loser of advisor headcount in 2025, because it just feels anecdotally, and some of the early movement data actually proves this, that they're just the most unhappy bunch of advisors on the street right now. Any thoughts on that?
I agree with you. We can't underestimate how big of a change the 2024 UBS comp plan was. It impacted very large teams who had next generations. It impacted teams with family members who were new in the industry. It certainly impacted smaller advisors where the threshold to be out of the penalty box was raised. It impacted folks with commission-based business since there was a cut to 12B1 fees. So my take is, even if an advisor was net neutral, it was such a big change that it makes every advisor just sit up and say, wow, I'm not fully in control of my compensation. I can do the best possible work and grow, and it's not predictable what my income is going to be next year. So I said this when we had a rapid reaction podcast about this change. I still don't think a compensation plan change alone is enough for someone to move, because there's a lot of other factors that come into play. but it is oftentimes the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I think a somewhat bold prediction on the UBS front is we're going to see some of the biggest teams in the firm leave, likely because of the time it takes to do due diligence and get everything prepared. We probably won't start seeing a lot of movement until the summer, maybe into the fall. But once these big teams leave, it's going to, I think, start some contagion where if a advisor who has a lot of respect for a $20 million team looks and sees them leave, it makes them think about what they're missing. And at a time when the firm is admittedly struggling with scale, looking to cut costs, as they lose some of their biggest and most profitable teams and more fall behind it, I think it's going to force UBS's hand to do something pretty drastic, whether it's a large acquisition, whether it's a merger or a sale, whether it's cutting compensation even further to juice their profit margins. So UBS is by far the most interesting firm to watch in 2025. And I don't think they're going to give us a shortage of headlines with advisors up and down the spectrum moving to alternative firms or alternative models.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's interesting. I think when I was thinking about the kind of why do we do this report, one of the reasons I came up with was around, I think it matters. There's power in seeing what your colleagues are doing. And the example I use is if you see hundreds of advisors leave a firm in a given year, that kind of begs the question, what's going on under the hood? And I think that's what you're alluding to with UBS is that there's a little bit of a momentum factor here when it comes to recruiting. And we definitely have seen this play out with other firms in the past where once like Edward Jones about 2 years ago is a good example of this. Once some of the largest and most productive advisors at the firm start to move, it opens up the floodgates. That's, I think, a good segue to when we think about movement, we oftentimes use the term pushes and pulls. Pushes are frustrations or limitations or factors that upset you about your current firm. And I would put this UBS dynamic squarely in the push category. But the pulls are things that excite you about a new firm or model. And included in that, I think, has to be recruiting deal, because there's no question a transition deal is an important component of advisor movement. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on deals, where they are now and where you think they'll go going forward. And you can give me both independent and W-2 answers.
Sure. Every year when we do this podcast or we write the report or just in general, kind of sound like a broken record that deals are at a high point. I don't think we're at any risk of that changing. But I also think, at least for 2025, we're not going to see a big pop in deals. I think in part it's because of interest rates getting lowered, which impacts a major source of profitability for firms. There's been a lot of scrutiny around net interest margin and cash sweep policies, some class action lawsuits and the like, where firms now have to pay a higher yield on client cash than before, which again is a major profit driver for them, especially on the independent side. But what's going to keep deals at least where they are is just all these different choices that advisors have and all the different competitive pressures that firms face when they're looking to recruit. I think what it's going to do too is, especially on the independent side, we saw that there were 3 or 4 firms that really set the market as far as the highest deal. Those firms, probably holding the line for a little bit, will give firms that were, let's say, middle of the pack on deal an opportunity to converge or close the gap and give themselves a better chance at picking up a share of advisor movement. So deals on both sides remain very strong. I'd say a medium to large size business on the traditional W-2 side can easily expect a deal of 300%, sometimes up to 400%. The structure certainly matters, though, more than the multiple, because it typically requires a lot of growth. And on the independent side, it can be anywhere from 70, 75% to 125%. And some firms will base deals on basis points and assets, which can help or hurt an advisor depending upon how they run their business, while others look at a multiple of gross dealer concession or GDC or trailing 12. So I think still great time to be an advisor because more choices, and because of that, very aggressive deals to help grease the skids of advisor movement.
Yeah, I agree. It does feel like the first time in many years, at least, that we're saying there are some headwind factors that might mean deals are going to get moderated or at least not increased to the same degree we've seen in the past. When you think about the scrutiny on cash sweep policies last year, which made wealth businesses less profitable, you think about the interest rate environment, and then you think about the market backdrop now, call it first quarter of 2025 with some of the tariff news and potential recession fears. There's no question that just from a purely kind of market dynamic perspective, firms might give some pause before writing some of these checks. But to me, the way you said it is spot on. It's less about like, what is the average deal going to do and more about for top teams, firms are still absolutely willing to go to bat and color outside the lines. I do feel like deals are a little bit less formulaic, though, where firms are getting more kind of case by case on analyzing deals. Do you agree with that?
I agree, especially around the dynamics of a retiring advisor. We've seen some firms pay a very high salary and not tie someone who wants to retire in a few years to a note. Or some firms would write a shorter note to someone retiring. Or some firms would look at kind of best ball for how to calculate trailing 12. So there's definitely some creativity. I also think what's going to be interesting is some of these market gyrations, which have not been positive since Trump took office, remain in place, and there's potential for recession and the trade war begins to heat up. Advisors' businesses are suddenly worth less. And a lot of folks will think, well, why don't I wait until my trailing 12 or my GDC is up to consider making a move or even selling my business? But firms can't really have that because they need the recruiting flows in order to bolster their growth and demonstrate constant momentum to their shareholders. So my prediction is if markets continue to go down or they're not cooperating, it's going to force firms to either pay more upfront to try to give advisors more guarantee or do things like taking the best 12 of 18 months to calculate a trailing 12 or looking at a rolling or average best 12 months to calculate an EBITDA multiple or giving advisors a greater opportunity to kind of true up what they could have earned before. So we've seen it before with the pandemic and certainly after that. But I think markets being choppy is just going to push firms to not necessarily be more aggressive, but to get more creative to try to overcome a very real objection that advisors may have.
Yep, I love it. I think that's brilliant. I'm going to shift gears now and talk about probably my least favorite topic, but I do think we need to mention it, which is compliance. And it ties into one of our predictions for the year. And honestly, you could say this about 2024 and even 2023, but the prediction is that it's going to get worse. And what I mean is zero tolerance, especially the biggest firms in the industry. So think the wires and the super regionals. Zero tolerance means zero tolerance. Things that might have gotten you a slap on the wrist several years ago or a warning now might very well, even a non-sales practice violation might very well result in heightened supervision, termination, dings to the U4, et cetera. Certainly don't say that as a scare tactic, but it does speak to our point that advisors need to at least have a plan B or at least start thinking about what a plan B might look like. So I just want to mention that because I do think it's an incredibly important dynamic going forward. And then one other one, completely unrelated, but I want to talk a little bit about a prediction we have in the independent broker-dealer space. One of the things that we get asked about in the independent broker-dealer space is how does a firm like LPL stack up against a firm like, let's say, a Commonwealth, a much more boutique-y, smaller scale firm? And our answer is there are benefits to both. There are benefits to the big players like LPL, Mosaic, and Cetera, and there are certainly benefits to the boutique players as well. But one of the dynamics we've seen play out in the past really 2 years, but a little bit before that is broker dealers are getting bought left and right. And it's typically those big mega cap firms like LPL and Mosaic that are the ones doing the buying. So I think a boutique firm is a phenomenal thing that's great on paper, but there is also some concern that a boutique firm means, are they ripe for acquisition going forward? And anytime a firm gets bought, it's highly disruptive to advisors. And we saw countless examples of that in 2024. Any thoughts on that, Lewis?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's not that many BDs that are of the meaningful enough size that they're prime acquisition targets, but there's certainly some. Most of the insurance-based firms divested of their wealth management units because the distribution play kind of dried up or wasn't as profitable. But I think too, what's happening is there's been a shift in the way independent advisors view their own organizations. Since it's become so competitive as far as pricing, platform fees, administrative fees, deals are high, it puts a lot of advisors in play. But I've seen advisors really migrate from the small mom and pop broker dealers and firms where I have a voice. I know the CEO, the president was at my kid's wedding. Some people covet that, but for the most part, advisors who remain in the independent broker dealer world look at their broker dealer now more as a partner or even as a vendor, if you want to take a kind of a colder arm's length view. And it's typically the larger firms that can invest hundreds of millions of dollars in technology, especially around things like AI. It's the firms that can push down pricing for advisors and clients. It's the firms that can get the most aggressive pricing with managers and alternative asset providers. They're also the firms that have mostly innovated around affiliation models and buying practices directly. So I think just advisors overall have begun to look at what they expect and what they want from a broker dealer in a different way. And that will continue to drive movement as well. And probably just means that the big are going to get bigger, the small are going to sell or kind of go away. And there's still plenty of room in the middle for advisors that want something more boutique, but also firms that have staying power.
Yep. And your point about what people want from their broker dealers changing is a good segue, because one of the things we've been pretty vocal about is proliferation of choice for advisors. And what we usually mean by that is firms offering various different ways to affiliate. So you consider a firm like Wells Fargo, they have their private client group, which is very much a wirehouse. They've got their bank channel, and then they have Finet, which is their independent channel. So the quintessential example of affiliation channel choice. One affiliation model that I think is not new this year, but really gained a lot of steam this year is independent W-2 models. Can you talk a little bit about what we mean by that and why these have been so attractive?
Yep. Yeah, I think it's a brilliant innovation. Just like any of these new types of firms that pop up are incremental innovations of building on something that existed, but changing either the economics or the support, et cetera. We saw it with the supported independent space, where very smart leaders realized that advisors wanted to go independent, but they didn't have an interest in compliance and finding real estate and the like. So they innovated on something that was already there. The same thing's happening in this independent employee or independent W-2 world, where many advisors want the benefits of independence. They want to own their own business, be able to sell it for capital gains, perhaps have their own brand, and just kind of be left alone. But they don't want to deal with employee benefits in real estate and some of the moving parts of running a business. So we've seen a handful of firms create kind of this best of both worlds model, where advisors get what I think are the most compelling parts of independence: ownership, high payouts, ability to create your own brand, but you hand off a lot of the day-to-day stuff that folks find unappealing. It's some of the larger firms that we mentioned that have this model, whether it's LPL or Raymond James or Stewart Partners, where advisors get book ownership, they get the things that they want as far as independence, but they have an option of whether or not they want to really be 1099s or K1s and own their own business, or if they prefer to be an employee like they were perhaps at their old firm. I think the other part of it is these independent employee models become the platform in which a lot of the larger broker dealers are acquiring practices on their platform. So the dynamic in the past was, if you're a $500 million plus firm, you really had to leave the broker dealer and sell in the RIA world or sell to a local firm, because there likely wasn't someone that had the capital or the expertise to take over a business of that scale. What we've seen, though, is, I think smartly, many independent firms are realizing that it's way cheaper to retain existing advisors than it is to recruit new ones. And if you can provide a liquidity solution and come with compelling enough deals, that there's a benefit for advisors to stay on platform. And how they're transacting is by converting these independent practices into W-2 employees that they own. It's very interesting on many levels, because it just goes to expanded choice and firms being able to serve advisors no matter what they're looking for, but also gives them a really helpful retention tool, or even just a path forward for someone who's joining, who says, hey, I might join as an employee or join as an independent, but it's really nice to know that in 10 years, when I want to retire, or I don't have my kid coming into the business, that I have an internal solution where I don't have to think about selling the business to an external party and going through another transition.
Yep, I love it. I think the way I kind of think about it is, these are kind of best of both worlds solutions, where a lot of people just feel that full-fledged independence is a bridge too far, having to source real estate and benefits, for example. And then there's also plenty of people who feel like captive W-2 options are just more of the same, or are not going to be needle moving enough. So these options are in some ways the best of both worlds. I'm going to give you a tough question now, and this is shifting gears a little bit, and it's kind of a fill in the blank. Private equity's biggest impact on the wealth management industry in 2025 will be X.
Ooh, that's a good one. I think a lot of different ways I can take it, but I would say we're kind of wrong with our 2024 prediction in this regard, but that private equity is going to make a meaningful impact on movement from the wirehouses and from private banks. What I mean by that is that there's over 200 private equity sponsors within the independent wealth management space, either backing an acquisitive RIA, a fintech, or the like. Most of these firms don't have the appetite or the economics or the cachet to attract teams from a captive environment. But right now there's probably 12 to 15 that we can think of that are very large national RIAs backed by private equity that are actively innovating how they structure deals and how they look to attract large teams coming from a wire or from a private bank or really any captive W-2 model. So typically, private equity backed RIAs look to acquire other RIAs. It's simpler. There's very much low hanging fruit there, tons and tons of M&A activity. But what's happening is the multiples in the market is bid up so much for RIA properties that naturally they're turning their attention to kind of an underserved market, which is the thought that wirehouse advisors, at least the right ones, they're growth oriented, they built their own business, they service, they tend to move 85% plus of their book. So if there's a way to structure a deal that's different than a traditional recruiting deal, meaning long-term capital gains, equity, perhaps a quicker off-ramp for someone looking to retire, and all the benefits of independence and more of a family office model, that there's something to be had. So firms like New Edge Wealth, Beacon Point, Corient, IEQ Capital, Crescent, and there's a ton that I'm missing, are very much positioned to take a bite out of the recruiting landscape. I think as we mostly look at advisor headcounts, there's no other way to do a report like this. I think it still may not show that they're capturing so many advisors, but I think they're going to capture enough large teams where everyone's going to have to take notice that these are very legitimate options for folks, either as an alternative to a wirehouse retire in place program or as a great long-term strategy for an advisor to diversify their own equity and get equity in something else that's growing and perhaps grow faster than they could in a more traditional brokerage environment.
Yep.
Anything I missed?
No, I love everything you just said. I think that's absolutely spot on, that it'll be about the next wave of private equity investments is likely to be finding ways to write deals for captive advisors. I also think as it relates to private equity, you're probably going to see a lot of private equity backed RIAs start to switch sponsors or switch investors as, private equity time horizons, typically 5 to 7 years. So I think it's fair to say that some of these RIAs that took private capital 5 years ago are probably starting to think about switching investors, and that has the potential to be disruptive as well.
One other thing I'll mention on this point is, as we've seen a lot of really successful advisors break away from mainly the wirehouses to go independent, they're now reaching maturity, if you will, where their platforms are built, they have more scale, they've kind of gotten through the transition and the like, and now they're businesses that private equity might want to invest in. And when private equity invests, they want to go out and acquire and recruit. But like we said earlier with the examples of John Thiel and Jim Dixon and Greg Fleming, there's something to be said about advisors who came from a firm, advisor who came from Merrill, being able to capture advisors from that firm. So I think the next wave of private equity backed RIAs are going to be some very large teams that everyone knows about who now have firms that are investable for private equity. And I think that will begin to tilt more advisors toward the space as well.
All right. I'm going to set a calendar reminder for exactly 1 year from now, and I'm going to invite you back and we're going to revisit this prediction because I think it's a really important one.
Absolutely.
I'd like to now talk to probably our favorite segment of the report, which is representative deals. And we try and highlight not necessarily the biggest deals of the year, although some of these are quite large, but really deals that we think tell a compelling story about advisor movement. So let's dive right in. We'll try and give some perspective on geography as well as size, but we really want to focus on the story of why we feel these teams opted to make the change they did. So the first one is, Lewis, let's talk about the year started with a bang. In January of 2024, Axiom Wealth Partners moved from Merrill to Rockefeller in Michigan. Tell me a little bit about this transaction.
Yep. So there wasn't a team that we had the privilege of representing, but when we looked at this more as a case study, I think this tells us three very interesting things. The first one is this was a team of Merrill lifers. They were all at the firm like pretty much their entire careers. And that segment typically was off limits for advisor movement. People worked at these firms cradle to grave. So the fact that a team of lifers decided to move, and not just move, but move to a firm outside the wires, shows that maybe there was something that they wanted to accomplish, or that there were frustrations with the way the culture has changed. So I think it's instructive that a very successful team of lifers that could have captured a very lucrative retire in place deal decided to instead transition. The other thing it tells me is that, like we said earlier, that if you're a large team, it's not definitive that you're going to go wirehouse to wirehouse. This team moved to Rockefeller, which is a boutique firm built on an RIA. That's a very different structure and model than a traditional wirehouse. So it shows that very large teams who have their pick of the litter are opting for alternatives like they never have before. But the last thing I think it shows is that while our report looks to capture the number of advisors moving, it's much more important to look at the size of these teams and what they represent. So a team managing 5 billion or more in assets is certainly one of the bigger ones at the firm and one of probably the top 5% of the industry. So we are seeing more and more of these businesses in play. And I think as many firms stop publishing advisor headcount data and look at, or even the ones that do, they report their net advisors, it can be a misleading figure because a team like this indicates a whole lot more than a team of 5 advisors doing a million of combined production.
Totally agree. We use the example all the time that a firm loses a $1 billion advisor and replaces that advisor with 2 trainees a year out of college, and congratulations, they've doubled headcount. So definitely a good example in the perils of using headcount as the metric on which to gauge recruiting success. I'll take the next one. The Alpha Group in New York City moved from UBS to Morgan Stanley. Team managed about 2.7 billion in assets, and they moved in September. I highlight this one in part because they're very large, almost a $3 billion team in a flagship marquee office here in New York City, obviously a headline grabber, but more so because this is a direct wirehouse to wirehouse intra-channel move. And that tells me something. That tells me that this team was not fed up with the wirehouse world. They were not the kind of team that says we'll never work as W-2 employees again. And we certainly hear that sometimes. Instead, they didn't feel like it was a problem with the model. They felt like it was maybe a little bit of a problem or some frustrations with their current firm. And we spoke a little bit about some of those cost-cutting concerns specific to UBS. But I also think you have to call out Morgan Stanley because they've probably done the best job as it relates to the wealth management space. It's such an important part of Morgan Stanley's DNA. And I don't think you can really say that about most of the other wires, really any of the other wires, that wealth management is their core business. And this team, another one we did not have the pleasure of representing, but it's clear they valued that Morgan Stanley's commitment and focus to wealth management. And then I am not naive to the fact that wirehouse to wirehouse deals are often also a little bit about, or sometimes a lot about, a transition recruiting deal. And that I'm sure played a part here as well. But a team of this size is usually moving in part for the money, but more about how can we serve clients in a more optimal way. We just have too much to lose. Go ahead, Lewis. You take the next one.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, the next one, kind of changing gears here, is a wirehouse to RIA move. Stead Mountain Advisors left Merrill to launch an independent RIA with the help of Dynasty Financial Partners in Alabama. This was a $420 million group, so a little bit smaller than the other ones we highlighted, but still a meaningful team. Wanted to highlight this one because this is a very common move when advisors go independent, is that instead of looking to build their own house and hire all the vendors themselves, they instead choose for a fee to outsource to a rock star team, in this case, Dynasty, to help them build the home of their dreams. So groups like this have a lot of options. They probably have the scale to start their own RIA, but instead they chose to pay a fee to Dynasty to help them organize everything. And what's notable too is we've seen a lot of chatter and debate in the industry. There's a big difference between starting your own RIA, whether it's with Dynasty or doing it without a support partner, versus joining a firm as an independent contractor. I don't necessarily think one is better or more advantageous. It just really depends upon what an advisor values and how much independence they want. But in this case, starting an RIA with Dynasty indicates that they wanted the maximum level of autonomy, but also were looking to outsource a lot of the day-to-day and certainly the heavy lift of the transition.
Love it. Now I'm going to handle the last one. I want to talk about a team that moved from a wirehouse model to a regional firm model. The deal I'll highlight is Mary Loretano, who moved from UBS to Raymond James in Florida. She managed a little over 500 million in assets, and she moved in July. And this was indeed one that we had the pleasure of working directly with. But I highlight this deal because to me, this is a very common type of move that maybe gets a little bit distorted, to your point earlier, Lewis, by if you look at just headline number of advisors in motion, because the regional firms tend to be smaller on a headcount basis than the wirehouses, it might look as if they're recruiting less successfully, but we know that not to be the case. And this type of move, moving from a wirehouse to a regional firm, and it's commonly Raymond James and RBC that we probably see winning most often. To me, here's the reason why. It is all about independence being a bridge too far, but the wirehouses being not a bridge far enough, right? The wirehouses are more of the same. I don't think they'll be meaningfully better. And we can argue the merits of that, whether that's true or not. But in the words of these advisors, it's because the wirehouses just don't feel like enough of a change. But independents, for either because of the economics, because of the lack of brand, the lack of support, the platforms, for whatever reason, independence is just a bridge too far. And the regional firms do a fantastic job. Their platforms are very good. Their infrastructure is very good. But where they really shine is culture, access to leadership, flat management structures, a more common sense approach to compliance and business friendliness. And I think that comes through when advisors meet with these regional firms like Raymond James. So just wanted to mention those representative deals, I think, give a really good flavoring of the types of transactions or transitions we saw in the market this year. There are some others highlighted in the report as well. So we'd invite you to go take a look at the report. And there's also more detailed information on these moves that we mentioned if you're curious about reading further. And just as a reminder, the report is available on our website. You can download your copy, and we will also include a link on this episode's page as well. Lewis, thanks so much for joining me. This was a blast, and I'm so excited for next year's episode.
Absolutely. It should be a very active year. So next year's episode, dare I say, be even better than this one.
A lot to talk about. I love it.
As a financial advisor, you hold yourself to the highest standards of integrity, honesty, and credibility. You are successful because you take your professional responsibilities seriously and are dedicated to your clients. But are you living your best business life? Are your goals aligned with your firm's, or could a better option exist? Should I Stay or Should I Go is a book written with you in mind. It's a self-guided journey that walks you through the key steps that we take with our advisor clients. This strategic thought process and roadmap to professional self-discovery is designed to help you ask the right questions and think critically and objectively, whether you're considering change or not. Learn how to get your copy at diamond-consultants.com/thebook.